It wasn't just a comment tossed into the whirlwind of daily politics. It was a siren, shrill and unmistakable. In that single sentence, Crockett signaled that the center of gravity in American media, once controlled by a handful of broadcast empires, had shifted. And if the old moguls weren't already pacing their penthouse suites, this was the night they began to lose sleep. For decades, television networks had been treated like steel fortresses: CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox giants who dictated what stories reached America's living rooms. From the Vietnam War to the O.J. Simpson trial, from presidential elections to terrorist attacks, their anchors were not just narrators of events, they were gatekeepers of reality. But Crockett's voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through that illusion. Power no longer resides in the boardrooms of traditional media. It belongs to those who dare to leave the system. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. Her words echoed like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom, and behind them stood three figures who had walked away from the comfort of late-night stages, trading laughter and monologues for something heavier: truth-telling on their own terms. Rachel Maddow, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel. Together, they had built what insiders whispered about as the underground newsroom. When Colbert first leaned into the camera years ago, parodying power with a smirk, he seemed destined to remain a satirist. Kimmel, the everyman in a suit, was known more for pranks and Oscars than for indictments of the establishment. Maddow, cerebral and cutting, carried the MSNBC brand on her shoulders, dissecting policy with the patience of a surgeon. Who could have imagined the three would abandon their respective stages and build a newsroom in defiance of the system that made them household names? The unthinkable had happened. They weren't just critics anymore. They had become competitors. And it was this rupture that Crockett seized upon. In a closed-door conversation, later leaked to reporters, she laid it out with ruthless clarity. The moguls are terrified, and they should be, because the velvet rope between audience and authority has snapped. When Maddow, Colbert, and Kimmel walked away, they proved the gatekeepers weren't necessary anymore. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. The quote circulated on social media like wildfire. Hashtags flared. Newsroom revolt. Media exodus. Crockett warning, each post a torch carried into the night, illuminating the fractures of a once unshakable empire. Somewhere in Brooklyn, an abandoned warehouse had been gutted and refitted with glowing screens, satellite rigs, and a newsroom table that looked less like furniture and more like an altar. The debut episode aired under the banner, Truth, Without Permission. The cinematic framing was unmistakable. Cameras panned across steel beams and shadowed corridors, then snapped to Maddow's steady gaze, Colbert's sardonic half-smile, Kimmel's unexpected solemnity. Together, they announced a new frontier in journalism, unfiltered, unsanctioned, and most importantly, beyond the reach of network executives. By the end of the first broadcast, whispers had turned to roars. The ratings, though cobbled together from streaming platforms and independent feeds, rivaled the network's primetime slots. The moguls, accustomed to measuring dominance in Nielsen points, were forced to confront a terrifying question. What if we no longer own the audience? It was into this charged atmosphere that Jasmine Crockett stepped. The Congresswoman from Texas had made a name for herself as a fierce debater, her words often sharper than the gavel in her hand. But this time, she wasn't defending policy or jousting in committee. She was making a declaration about the balance of power itself. Her warning was not random. Sources close to Crockett revealed that she had been briefed by media analysts who tracked the seismic shifts in audience behavior. Younger viewers had already abandoned cable for streaming. Trust in mainstream media was scraping historic lows. In that vacuum, the trio's newsroom didn't just look like an experiment, it looked like a revolution. "Don't underestimate the symbolism," Crockett said in an interview fragment that later trended on X. Three of the most recognizable faces in television turned their backs on their own platforms. That's not defection. That's a declaration of independence. Her phrasing landed with the cadence of history lessons: the Boston Tea Party, the Emancipation Proclamation, the March on Washington. Each comparison fueled the sense that this wasn't just media gossip. This was legacy, being written live. Meanwhile, inside the high-rise glass towers of the networks, unease spread like smoke. Executives ordered late-night meetings, their once proud view of the skyline now a mirror reflecting their fragility. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. What happens if this takes off? One network vice president was overheard muttering, "What if we're not the gatekeepers anymore?" Emails leaked from an internal strategy memo painted a grim picture. The subject line was stark: crisis, competing with independence. The memo warned of audience flight, advertiser hesitation, and the optics disaster of appearing outdated. One line stood out: if Crockett amplifies their credibility, the networks will bleed influence faster than we can negotiate renewals. For the first time in decades, the titans of broadcast looked like sleep-deprived interns, shuffling papers under flickering fluorescent lights, struggling to rewrite a script they no longer controlled. But Crockett's statement did more than rattle corporate suites. It sparked a chorus of questions across America. Who truly decides what counts as news in an age of live streams and podcasts? What happens when satire's architects step into the role of journalists? And, perhaps most unsettling, what if the moguls, the ones who spent half a century sculpting narratives, are no longer the sculptors but the clay? Each question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Viewers leaned forward, sensing that a mystery was unfolding not behind closed doors, but in plain sight. Behind the scenes, chatter among journalists grew feverish. Some hailed the trio as pioneers, reclaiming the craft of storytelling. Others dismissed them as opportunists staging a stunt. Yet in newsroom after newsroom, one phrase kept repeating: they've broken the seal. Once the first barrier falls, others tend to crumble. What if anchors from rival stations followed suit? What if respected reporters decided that the independence of a warehouse newsroom was preferable to the shackles of corporate sponsorship? What if Crockett's warning was not just prophecy but inevitability? Even as panic swirled, some observers couldn't help but note the irony. The same networks that once thrived on scandal and disruption were now paralyzed by a disruption of their own. The moguls who had built empires on the back of breaking news were watching their grip break apart. As one columnist quipped, broadcast executives used to sleep like kings. Now they toss like interns, wondering if the teleprompter will crash before showtime. The jab stung because it rang true. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. In the end, Crockett's warning crystallized a truth that moguls had long resisted. Power had never been theirs alone. It always belonged to the audience. And audiences, restless and skeptical, were choosing something new. The warehouse newsroom wasn't just an experiment. It was a signal flare, a declaration that trust and relevance were up for grabs. And once that flare was launched, there was no putting the night back into silence. As Crockett herself put it, you can't unhear the truth, and you can't unsee the cracks in a wall once the light has broken through. If you're following this unfolding drama, remember, this is only the first act. Like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because what happens when empires fall is never just about those in power. It's about those who dare to take it. The warning had been sounded. Jasmine Crockett's words were still reverberating across networks and news feeds when the real storm began. What happens when comedians, storytellers, and truth-tellers tear down the velvet curtains of broadcast television and set up shop in a warehouse? What happens when one Congresswoman declares that the titans of media are no longer titans? The answer is not merely disruption. It is open warfare, quiet at first, but unmistakable to those who knew where to listen. To understand the gravity of what Maddow, Colbert, and Kimmel had done, one must walk through the steel doors of their so-called underground newsroom. The first thing that strikes you is its lack of pretense. No glossy marble floors, no gilded logos. Instead, exposed beams, rough brick, and screens that pulse with feeds from every corner of the globe. A central desk anchors the room, a slab of wood reclaimed from a demolished courthouse, a deliberate symbol, according to those who helped design it. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. The message, one staffer whispered, is that truth belongs to the people, not to glass towers. From here, the trio orchestrates broadcasts that feel less like shows and more like tribunals. Maddow plays the surgeon, carving facts with meticulous precision. Colbert, the satirist turned archivist, punctuates with irony that lands like hammer blows. Kimmel, surprisingly somber, carries the role of everyman witness, translating outrage into plain speech. Together, they have crafted not just a newsroom, but a theater of reckoning. The moguls' sleepless nights. Meanwhile, uptown in Manhattan, the moguls could barely conceal their alarm. Boardrooms filled with the staccato of clicking pens, The shuffle of documents, the shrill urgency of conference calls that stretched past midnight. One leaked transcript of a meeting between network executives revealed their fear in raw form. If they're pulling numbers like this without advertisers, what happens when brands follow them? What happens when the audience realizes they don't need us anymore? The response was silence. Executives who had spent careers mastering spin suddenly found themselves with no script. The networks launched counterattacks, exclusive contracts for their remaining stars, aggressive promotions, even whispered campaigns that painted the trio's project as unserious. But each move seemed to collapse under its own weight. For every slick promo, the underground newsroom countered with raw authenticity. For every smear, Crockett's warning amplified louder. Power is leaving the glass towers. The industry had always thrived on control of images, narratives, and above all, documents. For decades, memos stayed locked inside filing cabinets or encrypted servers, safe from prying eyes. Leaks were the stuff of mythology, rare flashes of rebellion that executives believed they could stamp out with lawyers and public relations firepower. That illusion collapsed on a Tuesday evening. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. A slim folder, uploaded anonymously to a secure server, made its way into the hands of the underground newsroom. Inside, directives from a major television network once untouchable, now trembling in its glass tower. The language was clinical, almost sterile. Yet between the lines, the instructions were damning. Anchors were ordered to frame narratives in ways consistent with shareholder expectations. Reporters were warned to avoid undermining core corporate partnerships. Entire topics, healthcare profiteering, political donations, foreign lobbying were deemed inadvisable for primetime coverage. The documents were not just policy, they were proof. Proof that the network's sanctity as truth-tellers was a facade. Proof that behind the nightly smiles and teleprompter lines, every story was negotiated, packaged, and sanitized. Rachel Maddow opened the segment with a tone colder than steel. We've been told for years that what you see on these broadcasts is journalism. Tonight, you'll see what it actually is, a product, pre-approved by boardrooms before it ever reaches your living room. Her words landed like a verdict. Then came the theater. Colbert, with his trademark irony, read aloud a line from the documents, ensured criticism of advertisers remains within acceptable limits, and broke into mock applause. Finally, he quipped, a news organization brave enough to protect shampoo commercials from scrutiny. The audience erupted, laughter tinged with disbelief. But it was Kimmel who anchored the moment in gravity. Looking directly into the camera, his voice stripped of comedy, he said, if they're choosing what you hear based on who pays the bills, then you're not watching news. You're watching marketing disguised as truth. Clips of the segment spread like wildfire. Within hours, the phrase marketing disguised as truth trended on social media. Millions watched, shared, and demanded answers. For the first time, the moguls' walls seemed porous, vulnerable to the very information they had sought to bury. The leaked documents were dissected by analysts across platforms. Former journalists confirmed suspicions long whispered in hallways that the line between newsroom and boardroom had not just blurred, it had disappeared. One retired anchor admitted anonymously, "We all knew, we just never thought anyone would dare to show the receipts." The moguls scrambled, lawyers threatened action, PR statements denied editorial interference. Yet the evidence was visible, unspinnable, a wound that no press release could cauterize. What shocked the industry most was not merely the content of the leak, but the speed with which the underground newsroom weaponized it. Traditional networks would have dragged out a months-long investigation, carefully curated revelations, and framed them with balanced commentary. Maddow, Colbert, and Kimmel simply lit the match and let the flames speak for themselves. For viewers long skeptical of mainstream media, it was vindication. For the moguls, it was humiliation. And for Crockett, watching from Washington, it was the perfect setup for her next strike. If the leak had cracked the foundation of traditional media, Jasmine Crockett's second appearance was the sledgehammer. The Congresswoman was no stranger to high-stakes confrontations. In hearings, she was known for precision strikes, delivering lines that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. But when she beamed into the underground newsroom via satellite, she wasn't just a politician giving commentary, she was a herald declaring that the old order had ended. The broadcast opened with a wide shot. Maddow seated at the central desk, Colbert leaning forward, Kimmel unusually quiet. Then, in a box on the screen, Crockett appeared. She wasn't framed by the grandeur of Capitol Hill or the chaos of a hearing room. Instead, she sat in a plain office, the American flag behind her, her expression calm but unyielding. Her words came slowly, deliberately. This is not entertainment. This is emancipation from an industry that thought it owned the truth. And let me be clear, the truth does not belong to moguls. It belongs to the people who demand it. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. The sentence detonated across the digital sphere. Within minutes, hashtags erupted. Truth unlocked, Crockett unfiltered, media emancipation. Viewers clipped the video and circulated it across TikTok, Instagram, and X. Some paired it with images of network executives pacing under fluorescent lights, others with grainy footage of protests outside headquarters. But Crockett wasn't done. She spoke of her own experience with network bias, interviews trimmed to fit narratives, debates edited for spectacle. "I've seen how the game is played," she declared, "and I've seen who pays for the boardroom tables where those decisions are made." The studio fell silent. Even Colbert, usually ready with a quip, stayed still. It was as if Crockett had shifted from witness to judge, delivering a ruling that no one dared interrupt. Then she leaned closer, her voice lowering, sharpened to a blade. If the networks are trembling, it's because their monopoly on truth has ended. And what they fear most is not losing ratings, it's losing obedience. The phrase "losing obedience" ricocheted across the internet. Commentators replayed it endlessly, analyzing its implications. Was Crockett hinting that the networks had served not the public, but power itself? Was she suggesting that obedience, not truth, had been their currency all along? For the moguls, it was a nightmare scenario. A sitting member of Congress legitimizing their rivals on live broadcast. Behind the scenes, executives fumed. Lobbyists made calls. Draft statements were circulated with phrases like irresponsible commentary and dangerous rhetoric. But nothing could contain the tidal wave Crockett had unleashed. In the days that followed, her appearance was replayed on podcasts, analyzed in op-eds, debated in classrooms. Supporters hailed her as a truth-teller willing to break ranks. Critics accused her of theatrics, of aligning too closely with entertainers. Yet even detractors admitted the impact was seismic. For the underground newsroom, it was a gift. Maddow described it as a validation. Colbert, in a rare moment of sincerity, called it a turning point. Kimmel simply said, "That was bigger than us." Crockett herself seemed unfazed by the attention. In a brief follow-up interview, she shrugged off the frenzy. "I just said what everyone already knew," she remarked. "The difference is, now it's out in the open." And therein lay the brilliance of her strike. She hadn't revealed new information. She had given language to a feeling already simmering in the public consciousness. She had turned whispers into thunder. For the moguls, her words were not just criticism. They were prophecy. And for the millions watching, they were liberation. The underground newsroom style only sharpened as the weeks passed. They began producing segments that felt like cinematic indictments. The puppet strings. Colbert walked viewers through flowcharts, showing how corporations funded think tanks that shaped network narratives. The forgotten tape. Maddow unearthed archival footage that contradicted official accounts of policy debates. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. The audience's verdict. Kimmel hosted ordinary Americans, who read aloud the questions networks had ignored. Each broadcast was a collision between fact, performance, and rebellion. Ratings soared. Streaming servers crashed under demand. One analyst quipped, half in awe, half in fear. "They've turned news into a courtroom drama, and America can't look away." The networks were not about to surrender quietly. They hired crisis managers, crafted PR statements, and even deployed their most trusted anchors to deliver thinly veiled rebukes. One anchor intoned solemnly on air, "Real journalism requires accountability and structure, not theatrics in a warehouse." The irony was not lost on viewers, who clipped the segment and shared it alongside footage of the moguls' lavish galas. Memes bloomed overnight. Warehouse. Penthouse. But the moguls had one weapon left. Fear. Rumors spread of lawsuits, government inquiries, and behind-the-scenes lobbying to cut off the trio's access to distribution platforms. Insiders whispered of shadow campaigns designed to suffocate the underground newsroom before it became unstoppable. What the moguls did not anticipate was how quickly the public would turn suspicion back on them. Every leak, Every whisper of suppression became fuel for the trio's broadcasts. When word emerged that a major sponsor had pulled advertising from a network after internal debates about credibility, the underground newsroom aired the story within hours. "They thought they could silence us by tightening the screws," Maddow declared on air. "But all they've done is prove the screws exist." The line became a rallying cry. Protest signs appeared outside network headquarters bearing the phrase, "We see the screws. One is the plates." Executives who once glided confidently through marble lobbies now slouched in hallways, clutching coffee cups like lifelines. Insiders described panic meetings where strategies shifted by the hour. Some even joked that the moguls had begun keeping cots in their offices, unable to leave for fear of waking up to another revelation. The image of sleepless moguls became symbolic, a living metaphor for power slipping through manicured fingers. And it was Crockett who twisted the knife, telling reporters, "If they can't sleep, maybe it's because the truth has finally found them." Observers noted the delicious irony. Moguls who had dismissed comedians as lightweights were now being outmaneuvered by them. Colbert's irony, once a late-night diversion, had become a scalpel. Kimmel's everyman sincerity, once played for laughs, now drew tears. Maddow's analysis, once boxed inside cable, now spilled across the digital frontier uncontained. It was almost comical, if it weren't so catastrophic for the moguls, that island. Perhaps the most shocking revelation was not the leaks, nor Crockett's thunderous declarations, but the numbers. Independent audits revealed that the underground newsroom had drawn higher streaming viewership in its second month than any single network broadcast. The moguls' nightmare had arrived. Viewers were no longer theirs to command. And so the questions mounted. Who funds this defiance? Who protects it from the inevitable lawsuits? And, most chillingly, what happens if others follow? The answers remained cloaked in secrecy. But one truth was clear. Crockett's warning had not just foreshadowed the storm, it had unleashed it. One final leak cemented the sense of collapse. A transcript from a secret meeting among moguls described frantic discussions about hiring private investigators, lobbying Congress, even floating mergers to consolidate power. The final line of the transcript read like an epitaph. "We must do whatever it takes, because if we lose control of the narrative, we lose everything." The words, once confidential, now blazed across screens as the underground newsroom read them aloud. Colbert smirked. Maddow shook her head. Kimmel sighed. "Whatever it takes," Colbert repeated with mock solemnity, "is exactly what they've been doing for decades, and that's why nobody believes them anymore." By the end of the second month, the narrative was no longer in dispute. The moguls were on defense, the underground newsroom was on offense, and Crockett had become the unlikely herald of a media revolution. The climax came when a whistleblower revealed that executives had quietly pressured government regulators to investigate the trio. The revelation, aired live, landed like a detonation. Viewers flooded comment sections with outrage. Hashtags erupted again. Hands off news, no permission needed. The moguls had not just lost control. They had exposed their desperation. And as the credits rolled on another underground broadcast, Maddow left viewers with a chilling question. If this is how hard they fight to keep control, what does that say about what they're trying to hide? The leaks had torn the curtain. Crockett's words had turned whispers into thunder. And the moguls, once untouchable in their glass towers, now found themselves staring at their own reflections, haunted, sleepless, diminished. But revolutions don't end with revelations. They end or begin with reckoning. New York, the city that prided itself on never sleeping, became the perfect metaphor for the moguls who could no longer rest. High above the streets, in towers lit like fevered lanterns, executives paced marble hallways, clutching reports that no longer reassured. Ratings plummeted. Advertisers hesitated. Younger viewers vanished like smoke, consumed by the flame of something new. Meanwhile, across the river in Brooklyn, the underground newsroom thrummed with energy. Its warehouse glow pulsed like a heartbeat. Staffers moved with urgency, feeding cables, queuing segments, scripting lines. What had begun as a defiant experiment had become a rival empire. Not polished, but raw. Not predictable, but magnetic. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. And it was Crockett, steady in her resolve, who gave voice to what many already felt. The audience is the new boss, and the old guard can't fire them. The moguls tried one final gambit, reminding the public of their legacy. They aired montages of Walter Cronkite, of Barbara Walters, of the anchors who once carried the nation through wars and assassinations. They invoked nostalgia, as if memory itself might preserve their relevance. But the audience had moved on. They weren't nostalgic for authority. They were hungry for transparency. In one striking broadcast, Colbert held up a glossy montage clip and quipped, "Lovely memories, but what have you done for us lately?" The audience roared not just with laughter, but with recognition. The mogul's spell had broken. In a later interview, Crockett clarified that she wasn't celebrating chaos. She was acknowledging inevitability. "Institutions that hoard power always believe they can hold it forever," she said. "But history teaches us one thing: power moves. It moves when people move, and the people are moving." Her words echoed beyond politics, beyond media. They were a thesis on the fragility of empires. And though the moguls bristled, her warning had crystallized into truth. Audiences were no longer passive. They were participants, judges, and most dangerous of all, architects of the next narrative. For the executives, the dilemma was brutal: adapt or collapse. Some argued for embracing transparency, opening their doors to scrutiny. Others clung to the old ways, lobbying regulators, tightening contracts, leaning on dwindling advertisers. But the cracks were too visible. Once light enters a wall, it spreads. Once truth is leaked, it multiplies. And so, in hushed conversations and half-empty boardrooms, a grim realization set in. They were not just losing ratings, they were losing legitimacy. The underground newsroom, for all its triumphs, faced its own uncertainty. Could three personalities, however brilliant, sustain the weight of revolution? Could they withstand the lawsuits, the smear campaigns, the relentless scrutiny that awaited anyone who dared to claim independence? 0. 3. And beneath it all lurked the most unsettling question. What if one day they too became the very thing they opposed? Maddow, in a rare candid moment, addressed it directly. "We're not immune. Power corrupts. The difference is we've shown you the documents. We've given you the receipts. And if we fall, we expect you to hold us accountable too." It was a radical act, not claiming perfection but demanding vigilance from the very audience that empowered them. Picture it: the skyline at midnight. Glass towers glowing faintly, their executives restless inside. Across the river, the warehouse alive with light, its hum audible like a drumbeat of defiance. Between them, millions of screens flicker in living rooms, coffee shops, subway cars. A nation divided not just by politics, but by who they believe tells the truth. And in that tension lies the cinematic image of our era. Moguls staring at spreadsheets, Crockett at her microphone, Maddow with her notes, Colbert smirking, Kimmel frowning, and an audience that refuses to be silent. So where does it go from here? Do the moguls regroup, adapt, and claw back their dominance? Do the newcomers stumble, crushed under the weight of their own independence? Or are we standing at the edge of something unprecedented, a future where the gatekeepers are gone and truth is no longer owned but contested in the open? Crockett left her warning, but not an answer. And perhaps that is the point. The story of power is never finished. It shifts, it slips, it reemerges in new forms. The only certainty is this: the sleepless nights have just begun. What do you think? Are we witnessing the twilight of TV empires or the birth of a new one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow every revelation, every clash, every sleepless night in this unfolding drama, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.